The fluorescent lights above bed 7 flickered like a dying heartbeat as Dr. Rebecca Chen pressed her stethoscope against Margaret O'Sullivan's chest. What she heard made her hands freeze. Two distinct rhythms, one strong, one faint, beating in perfect counterpoint. "How long has this been there?" she whispered, staring at the mass protruding from the elderly woman's scalp like a grotesque crown. The paramedic, Jake Martinez, shifted uncomfortably. Bystanders said it was hidden under a knit cap. "She collapsed in the grocery store parking lot, ma'am. When the cap fell off." He trailed off, unable to finish. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and something else. Shame. "Please," she gasped, "don't call my son. Not yet." But Dr. Chen was already reaching for her phone, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "I need Dr. Morrison down here. Now." She paused, studying the pulsing growth. "In 30 years of emergency medicine, I've never seen anything like this." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan had spent 62 years perfecting the art of carrying burdens alone. Born on Chicago's South Side to Irish Catholic parents who believed suffering was a pathway to heaven, she learned early that complaints were prayers spoken to the wrong audience. Her weathered hands, stained from decades of grading elementary school papers, now trembled as she touched the hospital bracelet circling her wrist like a shackle. The growth had first appeared 7 years ago, 3 days after they lowered her husband Thomas into the frozen ground of Graceland Cemetery. She'd dismissed it as a stress bump, nothing more than grief made manifest in her grieving body. Thomas had carried his own invisible wounds home from Vietnam, nightmares that made him cry out in languages she didn't recognize, phantom pains in limbs that bore no visible scars. She understood that some battles followed soldiers home, settling into their bones like winter cold. Dr. Sarah Beth Morrison had built her reputation on the premise that every medical mystery had a logical solution. At 45, she possessed the focused intensity of someone who'd learned to channel personal loss into professional purpose. Her office walls displayed diplomas from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, but the framed photograph tucked beside her computer monitor told the real story. Two identical girls with gap-toothed smiles, arms wrapped around each other like they'd never let go. Catherine Morrison had been dead for 29 years, but Sarah Beth still set out 2 coffee cups every morning before remembering. The call from the emergency department shattered her Tuesday evening routine of reviewing surgical notes and avoiding phone calls from her 17-year-old daughter Ashley. The description Chen provided over the phone defied every textbook she'd memorized. A cranial growth exhibiting independent vital signs, neural activity that registered on EEG monitors, tissue that responded to external stimuli with what appeared to be purposeful movement. James Jimmy O'Sullivan inherited his father's broad shoulders and his mother's stubborn streak, a combination that served him well as a Chicago firefighter but complicated his role as dutiful son. At 38, he'd spent the last 5 years watching his mother retreat into herself, hiding behind cheerful deflections and strategic scarves. When his phone rang at the firehouse, he expected another request to fix a leaky faucet or move furniture. He didn't expect to hear that his mother was unconscious in Northwestern Memorial with a medical condition that had the emergency staff concerned and confused. Father Michael Patrick Kelly had ministered to 3 generations of O'Sullivans, baptizing babies, blessing marriages, and delivering last rites with equal measures of grace and Irish whiskey. At 70, his arthritic hands still moved with military precision when he administered communion, muscle memory from his days as an army chaplain in the jungles of Southeast Asia. He'd kept Thomas O'Sullivan's confession sealed for 45 years, but looking at Margaret's condition now, he wondered if some secrets were too heavy for one soul to carry alone. The automatic doors of Pete's Fresh Market had witnessed 40 years of neighborhood life, First Communion celebrated with sheet cakes, funeral luncheons planned between produce aisles, generations of families marking time with weekly grocery rituals. On this particular Tuesday evening in September, they opened to frame a scene that would haunt the Bridgeport community for months to come. Margaret O'Sullivan moved through the familiar aisles with the methodical pace of someone who'd been shopping the same store for 3 decades. Her autumn knit cap, a deep burgundy that complemented her Irish complexion, sat perfectly positioned to cover the secret she'd harbored for 7 years. The growth beneath had become as much a part of her routine as morning prayers and evening news, something acknowledged but never discussed, managed but never confronted. Maria Gonzalez had been working the checkout lane since her own children were small, and she'd developed an intuitive radar for customers in distress. Something about Mrs. O'Sullivan seemed different tonight, a tremor in her hands as she placed items on the conveyor belt, a glassy quality to her usually sharp blue eyes. The elderly woman fumbled with her wallet, dropping coins that scattered across the linoleum like scattered thoughts. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you feeling all right tonight?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd watched neighbors age and struggle. "You seem a little off." Margaret's laugh came out hollow, echoing strangely in her own ears. "Just tired, dear. Jimmy's got the grandchildren coming for dinner Sunday, and you know how that goes." She touched her cap unconsciously, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. "Getting old isn't for the weak, as my mother used to say." The headache struck without warning as Margaret pushed her cart toward the parking lot. It wasn't the dull ache she'd grown accustomed to over the past months, but something sharp and immediate, like lightning splitting her skull from the inside. Her vision blurred, the familiar landscape of parked cars and shopping carts becoming an impressionist painting viewed through tears. The world tilted sideways as Margaret's knees buckled. Her cart careened into a light post, groceries spilling across the asphalt like offerings to an indifferent god. The burgundy cap, which had faithfully guarded her secret through countless social gatherings and family dinners, tumbled away in the evening breeze. Mrs. Elena Kowalski, 73 and built like a Polish grandmother who'd survived the Depression, was loading her own groceries when she heard the commotion. She turned to see Margaret O'Sullivan on the ground, her carefully maintained dignity stripped away along with her protective headwear. What Elena saw made her cross herself 3 times and whisper a prayer in Polish her own grandmother had taught her for warding off evil. The growth protruded from Margaret's scalp like some grotesque fruit, roughly the size of a softball, but with an organic irregularity that suggested something alive. Its surface appeared smooth yet somehow textured, pale pink with darker veins that pulsed visibly beneath what looked like skin. Most disturbing was the way it seemed to move independently, a subtle shifting that had nothing to do with Margaret's labored breathing. Young Marcus Williams, a high school senior working his first job bagging groceries, dropped the shopping carts he'd been collecting and ran toward the store, his voice cracking as he shouted for help. His grandmother had always told him to help folks in trouble, but nothing in his 16 years had prepared him for this moment. He'd seen plenty of medical emergencies during his volunteer work with the local EMTs, but this was different. This was like stumbling into a medical textbook's chapter on things that shouldn't exist. Maria Gonzalez emerged from the store to find a small crowd forming around Margaret's prone form. Neighborhood instincts kicked in. Mrs. Peterson from Emerald Avenue knelt beside Margaret, murmuring comforting words while carefully avoiding direct contact with the exposed growth. Mr. Kowalski used his body to shield the scene from curious onlookers, his face set in the grim expression of a man who'd seen too much suffering in his 81 years. The 911 call crackled through the radio of Ambulance 19 at 7:47 p.m. Female, approximately 60 years old, collapsed in grocery store parking lot, possible head trauma. Bystanders report unusual cranial growth. Paramedic Jake Martinez, a 15-year veteran who'd seen everything from gang shootings to industrial accidents, exchanged glances with his partner, Luis Rodriguez. In their experience, unusual usually meant routine, but described poorly by civilians. They arrived expecting a standard medical emergency, perhaps a fall resulting in head trauma, possibly a stroke presenting with facial drooping that witnesses misinterpreted. What they found challenged every protocol they'd memorized and every case study they'd reviewed. Jake's initial assessment revealed vital signs that defied logic: two distinct pulse patterns, one strong and regular, another weaker but independent, as if two hearts were beating in one body. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake asked, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the tremor in his hands. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, revealing pupils that responded normally to his pen light. But her speech was slurred, words tumbling over each other like water over stones. "How long has this growth been present?" Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward her head, seeking the cap that was no longer there. The gesture broke Jake's heart. Even in her compromised state, she was trying to hide what had been hidden for years. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gathering crowd's murmurs. "Don't tell Jimmy. He has enough to worry about." Luis Rodriguez had been documenting vital signs when he noticed something that made him pause mid-notation. The growth appeared to be responding to their voices, subtle movements that corresponded to changes in tone and volume. When Jake spoke directly to Margaret, the mass seemed to orient toward the sound. When the crowd grew louder, it appeared to contract slightly, as if seeking shelter from the noise. The radio call to Northwestern Memorial's emergency department carried an undertone of confusion that Dr. Rebecca Chen had learned to recognize in her 20-year career. "Northwestern, this is Ambulance 19. We have a 62-year-old female with an unusual presentation. Large cranial growth, approximately 10 centimeters in diameter, appears to have independent vital signs. Patient is conscious but disoriented. ETA 4 minutes. Dr. Chen had graduated top of her class from the University of Chicago Medical School precisely because she thrived on unusual presentations. In the emergency department, unusual meant interesting, and interesting meant an opportunity to save a life that others might write off as hopeless. But as she prepared Bay 7 for Margaret O'Sullivan's arrival, she felt an unfamiliar flutter of apprehension. In medicine, truly unusual was often truly dangerous. And the automatic doors of the emergency department opened to admit a case that would challenge everything the medical team thought they understood about human physiology. Margaret O'Sullivan, her silver hair matted with perspiration and her dignity hanging by the thread of consciousness, was about to become the center of a medical mystery that would ripple through the halls of Northwestern Memorial and beyond. As the gurney rolled past the triage desk, Margaret's fingers clutched at Jake Martinez's sleeve with surprising strength. "Father Kelly," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of years of buried secrets. "Call Father Kelly. He'll know what to do." The words came out like a confession, and Jake found himself nodding. Though he had no idea who Father Kelly was or what he might know about the impossible thing growing from this grandmother's head. Dr. Sarah Beth Morrison arrived at Northwestern Memorial at 3:17 a.m., her surgical scrubs hastily thrown over the yoga pants and Northwestern University sweatshirt she'd been wearing while grading resident evaluations. The emergency department's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her angular face as she approached Bay 7, where Margaret O'Sullivan lay, surrounded by monitoring equipment that beeped in discordant rhythms. The first thing that struck Sarah Beth wasn't the size of the growth. She'd seen larger tumors in her 20-year career. It was the way the mass seemed to possess its own presence, a quality that defied medical terminology. The surface appeared smooth yet somehow alive, with a warmth that radiated beyond what normal body temperature should produce. Most unsettling was the subtle movement, a rhythmic expansion and contraction that synchronized with Margaret's breathing, yet maintained its own independent pattern. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm Dr. Morrison," Sarah Beth said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had comforted thousands of families facing neurological crises. "I need to examine you, and I want you to tell me if anything I do causes discomfort." Her gloved fingers approached the growth with the careful precision of someone who understood that this moment would define the trajectory of treatment. The tissue felt unlike anything in her experience, not the firm resistance of typical tumors, nor the soft compliance of cysts, but something that seemed to respond to her touch with what could only be described as awareness. Margaret's eyes tracked the doctor's movements with surprising clarity for someone who'd collapsed less than 2 hours earlier. "Doctor, I need you to understand something," she said, her Irish accent thickening with exhaustion and medication. "This thing, whatever it is, it's been part of me for 7 years. It's not trying to hurt me. I think it's trying to protect me from something." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been rehearsing this explanation for years but never expected to deliver it. The examination room door burst open with the controlled urgency that marked family members in crisis. Jimmy O'Sullivan filled the doorway, his firefighter's uniform still bearing traces of smoke from the warehouse call he'd abandoned when his captain received the hospital's phone call. Behind him, his wife Linda clutched the hands of their 2 children, 12-year-old Emma, whose solemn brown eyes seemed to absorb everything, and 8-year-old Tommy, who pressed his face against his mother's side to avoid looking at his grandmother's exposed condition. "Ma, Jesus Christ, what the hell is that thing?" Jimmy's voice cracked with the particular anguish of a man whose job required him to remain calm during emergencies, but who'd never prepared for his own family to become the emergency. His training kicked in as he scanned the monitors, mentally cataloging vital signs while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Linda's nursing background served her better in processing the medical reality, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional impact of seeing her mother-in-law's long-hidden secret. "Kids, why don't you go sit in the waiting room while the adults talk?" she suggested, but Emma stepped forward with the quiet determination of a child who'd inherited her grandmother's stubborn streak. "I want to stay," Emma announced, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed to surprise even herself. "Grandma's been carrying this alone for years. She shouldn't have to explain it alone, too." The wisdom of the statement hung in the air like incense, and for a moment, the adults in the room remembered what it felt like to see the world with a child's clarity. Dr. Morrison found herself studying the family dynamics as much as the medical mystery. The way Jimmy positioned himself between his children and his mother suggested years of protective instincts. Linda's gentle but firm guidance of the children spoke to experience managing crisis. Most interesting was Emma's reaction. Instead of fear or revulsion, the girl displayed curiosity and compassion that seemed to calm everyone in the room. Father Michael Patrick Kelly arrived 45 minutes later, his black clergy shirt wrinkled from sleep and his silver hair disheveled, but his presence immediately shifted the room's energy. At 70, he moved with the careful dignity of someone whose body had begun to betray him but whose spirit remained unbroken. He took one look at Margaret's condition and crossed himself, not in horror but in recognition. "Maggie, my dear child," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed with the familiarity of decades of shared history. "How long have you been carrying this burden alone?" His voice carried no judgment, only the infinite patience of a man who'd spent 50 years listening to confessions and learning that human suffering rarely fit into tidy categories. Margaret's composure which had held through the paramedics' questions and the medical team's examinations, finally cracked at the sound of Father Kelly's gentle concern. Tears tracked down her cheeks as she reached for his weathered hand. "Since Thomas died, Father. It started 3 days after the funeral. I thought it was grief made manifest, you know. The Irish carry their sorrows in their bodies." The priest's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that Dr. Morrison's trained eye caught but couldn't interpret. Father Kelly's fingers tightened around Margaret's hand as if anchoring both of them to some shared understanding. "There are things about Thomas's passing that we need to discuss," he said carefully, glancing meaningfully at the family gathered around the bed. "Things that might help explain what's happening to you now." Jimmy's firefighter instincts recognized evasion when he heard it. "Father, if you know something about what's wrong with my mother, we need to hear it. All of it. No more family secrets." His voice carried the edge of a man who'd spent his career breaking down doors to reach people in crisis, and who wouldn't tolerate barriers now when his mother needed help. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, her medical training demanding precedence over family drama. "Before we discuss potential causes, we need to understand what we're dealing with medically." She pulled up the preliminary CT scan on the room's monitor, the black and white images revealing the growth's internal structure. "What we're seeing here challenges conventional medical understanding. The mass contains what appears to be neural tissue, brain matter, but it's not connected to Mrs. O'Sullivan's brain." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors and Tommy's quiet sniffling. Linda pulled both children closer, her nursing instincts warring with her desire to protect them from information too complex and frightening for young minds to process. Emma stared at the scan with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle, while Tommy pressed his face more firmly against his mother's side. "What does that mean, exactly?" Linda asked, her professional training helping her formulate the question the family needed answered. "Is it cancer? Is it connected to her brain? Can it be removed?" Dr. Morrison chose her words carefully, aware that every statement would be dissected and remembered by a family desperate for hope and terrified of losing their matriarch. "The tissue shows characteristics we typically associate with a condition called fetus in fetu, essentially the absorbed remains of a twin that was never fully developed. But this case is unusual because the tissue appears to have continued developing over decades, which shouldn't be medically possible." Father Kelly's sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention. The priest's face had gone pale, and his free hand moved to the small silver cross that hung from his neck, a gesture Margaret recognized from the most serious moments of Thomas's confessions. "Doctor," he said slowly, "would such a condition be hereditary? Could it be triggered by emotional trauma or grief?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, and Dr. Morrison found herself entering territory where medical science intersected with mysteries she couldn't quantify. "There are documented cases of physical symptoms manifesting in response to severe psychological stress," she admitted. "But what we're seeing here goes beyond anything in the literature. This isn't just tissue, it appears to be functioning neural matter with its own blood supply and electrical activity." Margaret's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the weight of years of careful observation and growing understanding. "Doctor, I need to tell you something that might sound crazy, but I think this thing, whatever it is, has been listening. Not just to conversations, but to my thoughts, my feelings, my grief over Thomas. Sometimes, when I'm very sad or very frightened, I swear I can feel it trying to comfort me." The following 3 weeks transformed Northwestern Memorial Hospital into a hub of unprecedented medical activity. Dr. Sarah Beth Morrison assembled a team of specialists from across the country, each bringing expertise in fields that had never before converged on a single case. The neurology department buzzed with activity as residents and attending physicians gathered around Margaret O'Sullivan's charts, debating theories that challenged everything they'd learned in medical school. Dr. David Kim, Northwestern's chief radiologist, had performed over 10,000 scans in his career, but Margaret's case left him staring at images that defied interpretation. The growth showed clear neural pathways, organized structures that resembled brain tissue, and most remarkably, electrical activity that registered on EEG monitors. It's like looking at a fully functional brain that's been growing independently for decades, he explained to the weekly case conference, his usually steady voice betraying fascination and concern. The tissue shows REM sleep patterns that don't correspond to Mrs. O'Sullivan's sleep cycles. Margaret had been moved to a private room on the neurology ward, where she'd become something of a celebrity among the nursing staff. Despite the unusual circumstances, she maintained the gracious demeanor of a retired teacher, asking about the nurses' families and remembering details about their lives with the sharp memory that had made her beloved among generations of elementary school students. The growth, which the family had begun referring to as Catherine, after Dr. Morrison's lost twin sister, seemed to respond positively to music, particularly the Irish folk songs Margaret hummed during quiet moments. Jimmy had taken family leave from the Chicago Fire Department, a decision that sparked conversations throughout the firehouse about duty to family versus duty to the community. His captain, a gruff man named Patrick O'Brien, who'd served with Jimmy's father in a different kind of war, pulled him aside before he left. "Son, I've seen men carry all kinds of burdens," O'Brien said, his Irish brogue thickening with emotion. "Some carry them on their backs, some in their hearts, and some apparently on their heads. You take care of your ma. The fires will still be here when you get back." The children adapted to their grandmother's condition with the remarkable resilience that had always amazed the adults in their lives. Emma appointed herself as Margaret's primary entertainer, bringing schoolwork to the hospital and reading her book reports aloud. She'd discovered that Catherine seemed to respond to certain types of literature. Fairy tales and stories about families separated and reunited appeared to create more pronounced movement in the growth. Tommy, initially terrified, gradually overcame his fear through his sister's example and began drawing pictures that included Catherine as a benevolent presence watching over their family. Linda found herself serving as translator between the medical team and the family, her nursing background helping her interpret the increasingly complex terminology that surrounded Margaret's case. She attended every consultation, taking meticulous notes and asking the questions that Jimmy was too overwhelmed to formulate. Her own children's acceptance of their grandmother's condition challenged Linda's preconceptions about normalcy and taught her that love could expand to encompass realities she'd never imagined possible. The medical investigation deepened as Dr. Morrison's team attempted to understand how Catherine had developed consciousness over several decades. Genetic testing revealed that the growth contained DNA distinct from Margaret's, confirming the absorbed twin theory, but the tissue showed genetic markers that suggested an unusual capacity for neural development. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in developmental neurology from Johns Hopkins, joined the team via video conference and provided insights that both illuminated and complicated the case. "What we're observing challenges our understanding of consciousness itself," Dr. Rodriguez explained during a team meeting that included Margaret and her family. "The neural tissue shows patterns associated with memory formation, emotional processing, and sensory integration. It's as if this absorbed twin has been experiencing life through Mrs. O'Sullivan's senses while developing her own cognitive processes." The explanation provided scientific framework for what Margaret had intuitively understood. Catherine wasn't just tissue. but a presence that had shared her life experiences. Father Kelly's visits became daily occurrences, and his conversations with Margaret grew increasingly intense and private. The priest would arrive each afternoon carrying his worn breviary and a thermos of tea that he'd prepared according to a recipe Margaret's mother had taught him 40 years earlier. Their discussions, conducted in low voices behind the partially closed privacy curtain, seemed to revolve around memories, confessions, and connections that predated Catherine's appearance by decades. The broader Chicago community began to take notice as word of Margaret's condition spread through the tight-knit neighborhood networks that defined Bridgeport, St. Alphonsus Church organized prayer vigils, not for Margaret's healing, but for understanding and acceptance of God's mysterious ways. The Ladies' Auxiliary, led by Mrs. Kowalski, who'd witnessed Margaret's collapse, organized meal trains for Jimmy's family and established a fund to help with medical expenses that insurance might not cover. Media attention intensified as medical journals began requesting case studies and television news programs sought interviews with the family. Dr. Morrison found herself fielding calls from colleagues around the world, each offering theories or requesting access to Margaret's medical data. The hospital's public relations department worked overtime to protect the family's privacy while managing the legitimate scientific interest in Catherine's unprecedented development. The ethical implications of Margaret's case prompted the hospital to convene a special ethics committee comprised of medical professionals, philosophers, and religious leaders. The central question they grappled with wasn't whether Catherine was alive. The neural activity clearly indicated some form of consciousness, but what rights, if any, she possessed as a sentient being who existed as part of another person's body. Dr. James Washington, a bioethics professor from the University of Chicago, argued that Catherine represented a new category of existence that required entirely new ethical frameworks. Jimmy struggled with questions that had no precedent in his experience as a firefighter or son. His training had taught him that every rescue involved clear choices between life and death, safety and danger. But Margaret's situation defied such binary thinking. Catherine wasn't threatening his mother's life in any immediate sense, yet her presence created medical risks that could prove fatal if left untreated. The growth was slowly increasing intracranial pressure, a condition that would eventually require surgical intervention regardless of the ethical considerations. Margaret herself became the most articulate advocate for understanding Catherine's nature and needs. During lucid moments between periods of headache and fatigue, she described sensations and experiences that suggested a complex relationship with her absorbed twin. "She dreams," Margaret told Dr. Morrison during one particularly detailed session. "I can feel her dreams sometimes, especially when I'm falling asleep. They're not my dreams. They're about places I've never been and people I've never met. But they're peaceful dreams, full of music and light." The hospital's chaplain service, led by Father Thomas McMahon, a younger priest who'd studied both theology and psychology, began working with Margaret to explore the spiritual dimensions of her condition. His conversations with Father Kelly revealed layers of family history that seemed relevant to understanding how Catherine had developed such complex consciousness. "There are patterns in this family," Father McMahon observed, "patterns of carrying burdens for others, of sacrifice that transcends normal human capacity." Dr. Morrison found herself personally invested in Margaret's case beyond professional obligation. Her own history of twin loss created an emotional resonance that complicated her clinical objectivity, but also provided insights that purely scientific analysis might miss. She began spending extra time with Margaret, not just as a physician, but as someone who understood the profound impact of twin relationships on individual identity. "Catherine isn't just an absorbed twin," she confided to her colleague, Dr. Kim. "She's a twin who chose to stay, to protect and comfort her sister through a lifetime of challenges. The medical team's growing understanding of Catherine's consciousness raised questions about treatment options that had no precedent in medical literature. Traditional surgical removal, the standard treatment for absorbed twin syndrome, seemed ethically questionable when applied to a sentient being. Yet allowing Catherine to continue growing posed increasing risks to Margaret's health and cognitive function. The pressure on Margaret's brain was beginning to affect her memory and motor skills, subtle changes that the family noticed even if the medical monitoring hadn't yet documented significant deterioration. As October progressed, the weight of decision-making settled on the family like Chicago's early winter fog, pervasive, chilling, and impossible to ignore. Margaret's condition was stable but not sustainable. Catherine's presence, while no longer hidden, had become a medical emergency disguised as a miracle. The intersection of love, science, faith, and ethics created a crossroads where every path forward required sacrifices that no family should have to make. October 1st arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital with the weight of inevitability that medical professionals recognize in cases where all roads lead to the operating room. Dr. Sarah Beth Morrison stood before the assembled ethics committee, her 20 years of surgical experience lending gravity to words that would determine the fate of two conscious beings sharing one body. The conference room, normally used for routine administrative meetings, had been transformed into a courtroom where medical science would judge the boundaries between individual identity and collective survival. The neurological evidence is unambiguous, Dr. Morrison began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd learned to deliver devastating news with compassion. Catherine, the absorbed twin, shows brain activity consistent with consciousness, memory formation, and emotional processing. However, her continued growth is creating dangerous intracranial pressure that will prove fatal to Mrs. O'Sullivan within weeks. We're facing a situation where inaction guarantees one death, while surgery presents ethical questions we've never had to address. Dr. James Washington, the bioethics professor whose presence had been requested by the hospital administration, leaned forward in his chair with the intensity of someone grappling with philosophical problems that had real-world consequences. Dr. Morrison, in your professional opinion, does Catherine exhibit qualities that would qualify her as a person with individual rights, separate from Mrs. O'Sullivan? His question hung in the air like incense, sacred and heavy with implication. The answer required Dr. Morrison to venture beyond medical training into territory that belonged to philosophers and theologians. The neural activity patterns we've documented suggest awareness, response to stimuli, and what appears to be preference formation. Catherine responds positively to music, shows agitation during stressful family conversations, and demonstrates sleep cycles independent of Mrs. O'Sullivan's. If consciousness is the measure of personhood, then yes, Catherine appears to meet that criteria. Father Kelly, who'd been granted special permission to participate in the committee's deliberations, spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades counseling families through impossible choices. Doctor, Mrs. O'Sullivan has described communication with Catherine, not verbal communication but emotional exchange. She believes Catherine has been comforting her through grief and trauma for years. How do we weigh the right to continued existence against the reality that Catherine's existence depends entirely on another person's body? The question exposed the heart of the ethical dilemma. Catherine possessed consciousness but lacked independent physical existence. She was simultaneously a person and part of another person, a paradox that challenged every framework the committee had for understanding individual rights. Dr. Rodriguez, participating via video link from Johns Hopkins, offered the perspective of someone who'd studied consciousness in cases of severe brain injury. We must consider that Catherine's consciousness, while real, exists in a state of complete dependency that we wouldn't normally consider viable for independent life, Dr. Rodriguez observed. She has no capacity for autonomous action, no ability to communicate her wishes directly, and no possibility of survival separate from Mrs. O'Sullivan. These factors must influence our ethical calculations. Margaret herself had requested permission to address the committee, a request that the hospital's legal team had initially opposed but eventually approved. Sitting in her wheelchair, her silver hair carefully arranged to partially conceal Catherine's presence, she spoke with the dignity of someone who'd taught children to respect both authority and truth. Doctors, I appreciate your concern for Catherine's well-being, but I need you to understand something important. She and I have been partners in this life for 7 years. I can feel her fear right now, her confusion about why everyone is so concerned. She doesn't understand that her growth threatens me. She only knows that she's been helping me carry sorrows too heavy for one person to bear. Jimmy O'Sullivan, granted permission to speak as Margaret's primary family advocate, struggled with words that could determine his mother's fate. His firefighter's training had taught him to make split-second decisions in life-threatening situations, but those decisions always involved clear distinctions between victims and threats. "My mother is dying," he said, his voice breaking with the strain of stating the obvious truth everyone was avoiding. "I don't understand all the medical terminology or the ethical arguments, but I know my mother is getting weaker every day. If surgery can save her life, then we need to have that surgery." Emma O'Sullivan, at 12 years old, had been deemed too young to formally address the committee, but her written statement was read aloud by the hospital's patient advocate. "My grandmother told me that Catherine has been her guardian angel for 7 years. She said Catherine took on all the sadness about Grandpa's death so Grandma could keep taking care of our family. If Catherine is really like a person, then maybe she would want to help Grandma live, even if it meant she couldn't stay anymore. Angels don't stay forever. They help when they're needed and then go back to heaven." The child's logic cut through the philosophical complexities with startling clarity, reframing the discussion from one of competing rights to one of sacrificial love. Dr. Morrison found herself considering whether Catherine's consciousness might include understanding of her role in Margaret's life and acceptance of the implications of that role. Dr. Michael Chen, Northwestern's chief of staff, addressed the practical realities that the committee couldn't ignore. Regardless of our ethical conclusions, Mrs. O'Sullivan's medical condition is deteriorating. The latest scans show increased brain swelling and early signs of cognitive impairment. We have perhaps 2 weeks before the situation becomes immediately life-threatening. If we're going to perform surgery, it needs to be scheduled soon. The committee's deliberations extended through 3 days of testimony from medical experts, ethicists, religious leaders, and family members. Each perspective added layers of complexity to a decision that had no precedent in medical literature or legal framework. The case had attracted attention from bioethics scholars around the world, many of whom submitted written opinions that the committee reviewed as part of their deliberation process. Father McMahon, the hospital chaplain, offered a perspective that bridged religious doctrine and practical compassion. In Catholic teaching, we believe that life is sacred from conception to natural death. Catherine clearly possesses life in some form. However, we also believe in the principle of double effect, that an action with a negative consequence can be morally justified if the intention is to achieve a positive outcome and the negative consequence is not directly intended. Surgery to save Mrs. O'Sullivan's life, even if it results in Catherine's death, could be justified under this principle. The committee's final session included Margaret's own statement of informed consent, delivered with the clarity of someone who'd made peace with an impossible choice. I've lived 62 years, raised a good son, loved a good man, and taught hundreds of children to read and write. Catherine has been my companion through the hardest part of my life, and I'm grateful for every day we've had together. But she came to help me live, not to help me die. If surgery gives me more time with my grandchildren, then I believe Catherine would want me to have that time. Doctor. Morrison's final recommendation to the committee synthesized medical necessity with ethical consideration. Surgery to separate Catherine from Mrs. O'Sullivan is medically indicated to preserve Mrs. O'Sullivan's life. While Catherine possesses consciousness, her existence is entirely dependent on another person's body, and her continued growth threatens that person's survival. We recommend proceeding with surgical separation while taking every possible measure to preserve Catherine's tissue for research that might help us understand consciousness and twin development. The committee's unanimous approval came with conditions that reflected their recognition of Catherine's unique status. The surgery would be performed with the same respect and care given to any patient. Catherine's tissue would be preserved and studied with the goal of advancing medical understanding of consciousness and twin development. The family would receive psychological counseling to help process their loss, and the case would be documented as thoroughly as possible to provide guidance for any similar situations that might arise in the future. Margaret signed the surgical consent forms on October 7th. Her signature steady despite the tremor in her hands. Father Kelly performed a blessing that acknowledged both Catherine's contribution to the family and the necessity of letting her go. Jimmy held his mother's hand as she made her mark on documents that would separate her from the companion who'd shared her consciousness for 7 years. The surgery was scheduled for October 8th at 6 in the morning, when the operating rooms were quiet and the surgical team could work without the usual hospital bustle. As Margaret was wheeled toward the preoperative area, she touched the growth one final time, whispering words that only Catherine could hear. "Thank you for staying with me through the hard times. Thank you for carrying what I couldn't carry alone. It's time for you to rest now." The growth pulsed gently beneath her fingers, one last communication between sisters who'd shared a lifetime in 7 years. The surgical suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital had witnessed thousands of operations, but Operating Room 3 felt different on the morning of October 8th. Dr. Sarah Beth Morrison arrived at 5:30 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled surgery, needing time to center herself for a procedure that would challenge everything she understood about the boundaries between life and death. Her surgical team, assembled from specialists across the country, moved through their preoperative preparations with the solemnity of people who understood they were participating in medical history. Margaret O'Sullivan was wheeled into the preoperative holding area at 5:45, her silver hair secured beneath a surgical cap that, for the first time in 7 years, didn't need to hide anything. Father Kelly had performed last rites 30 minutes earlier, a ceremony that acknowledged both the woman going into surgery and the presence that would not emerge. Margaret's eyes remained clear and calm, fixed on a photograph of Thomas that Jimmy had taped to the ceiling above her gurney, a final gift to help her through the journey ahead. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, how are you feeling?" Dr. Morrison asked, taking Margaret's hand in both of hers. The gesture went beyond standard preoperative protocol, acknowledging the unique relationship between surgeon and patient that had developed over the past month. Margaret's fingers were steady, warmed by a peace that seemed to radiate from somewhere deeper than courage. "I'm ready, Doctor," Margaret replied, her Irish accent softened by preoperative medication but still carrying the strength that had sustained her through decades of teaching children and loving difficult men. "Catherine and I had a long talk last night. She's ready, too. She knows she helped me when I needed help most, and now it's time for her to rest." Her words carried the certainty of someone who'd made peace with necessary sacrifice. The operating room filled gradually with the surgical team Dr. Morrison had assembled. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the developmental neurologist from Johns Hopkins who'd flown in specifically for this case. Dr. Michael Kim, the anesthesiologist whose expertise in complex cranial surgeries had earned him recognition throughout the Midwest. Dr. James Patterson, the neurosurgical resident whose steady hands and sharp mind had impressed Morrison enough to include him in this unprecedented procedure. In the family waiting room, Jimmy O'Sullivan paced the perimeter with the restless energy of someone whose training demanded action, but whose circumstances required patience. Linda sat with Emma and Tommy, reading quietly from a book of Irish fairy tales that Margaret had given Emma for her birthday. The choice of reading material wasn't accidental. The stories of magical beings who helped mortal families through difficult times seemed appropriate for the day when their own family's guardian spirit would finally depart. Father Kelly arrived at the hospital carrying a thermos of tea and a worn leather journal that had belonged to Thomas O'Sullivan. The priest's presence comforted the family not just through his spiritual authority, but through his connection to generations of O'Sullivan struggles and triumphs. His quiet prayers created a sanctuary of calm within the antiseptic anxiety of the surgical waiting area. Dr. Morrison began the procedure at precisely 6 a.m., her first incision marking the beginning of an 8-hour surgery that would test every skill she'd developed over 2 decades of neurosurgical practice. The initial approach revealed that Catherine's integration with Margaret's skull was more complex than the imaging had suggested. Neural pathways had developed connections that seemed almost deliberate, as if Catherine had been carefully positioning herself to monitor and influence Margaret's emotional state. 2 hours into the surgery, complications arose that hadn't been anticipated despite months of planning. Catherine's vascular system had become so intertwined with Margaret's that separating them required microsurgical precision that pushed the limits of current medical technology. Dr. Rodriguez, monitoring Catherine's neural activity throughout the procedure, reported brainwave patterns that suggested awareness of the surgical process, not pain, thanks to the anesthesia, but something resembling recognition of impending change. In the waiting room, the O'Sullivan family had been joined by Margaret's former colleagues from Lincoln Elementary School, where she'd taught 3rd grade for 35 years. Mrs. Patricia Walsh, the principal who'd hired Margaret in 1985, sat quietly with a stack of cards from current students who'd heard about their former teacher's condition. The children's artwork decorated the waiting room walls, crayon drawings of families protected by guardian angels that bore striking resemblance to the descriptions Emma had shared about Catherine. Part 4 of the surgery brought the most dangerous phase of the separation. Catherine's neural tissue had grown around critical blood vessels that supplied Margaret's brain, requiring Dr. Morrison to rebuild vascular pathways while preserving both women's neurological function. The surgical team worked in focused silence, each member aware that their decisions in these moments would determine whether Margaret emerged with her personality and memories intact. Dr. Kim, monitoring both sets of vital signs throughout the procedure, noticed something that challenged his understanding of consciousness and death. As Catherine's neural tissue was gradually separated from Margaret's system, her brain activity didn't simply cease, it appeared to reorganize itself, consolidating into patterns that resembled deep sleep rather than death. "It's as if she's choosing to let go peacefully," he whispered to Dr. Morrison, his voice barely audible through his surgical mask. The separation reached its critical point during hour 6, when the final neural connections between Catherine and Margaret were severed. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd been monitoring both sets of brain activity, watched Catherine's EEG patterns shift into something resembling the brain waves associated with peaceful death, organized, purposeful, and strangely beautiful. Margaret's vital signs remained stable throughout, her brain responding to the decreased pressure with immediate improvement in function. Jimmy felt the change before any medical monitor registered it. At exactly 12:15 p.m., he stopped pacing and turned toward the surgical suite, his firefighter's intuition recognizing the shift in energy that marked the transition between crisis and resolution. "Something's happened," he told Linda, though he couldn't explain how he knew. "Something's changed." Dr. Morrison emerged from the operating room at 2:30 p.m., her surgical scrubs soaked with perspiration, and her face bearing the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd pushed medical science into uncharted territory. The surgical mask had left marks around her eyes, but those eyes carried light that hadn't been there when she'd entered the OR 8.5 hours earlier. "The surgery was successful," she announced to the assembled family, her voice hoarse from hours of concentrated effort. "Both Margaret and Catherine are stable," Dr. Morrison continued, choosing her words carefully to honor the complexity of what had just occurred. "Your mother's brain function is excellent, better than we'd hoped. The pressure relief has already begun improving her cognitive responses, and Catherine—" She paused, searching for language that could describe the indescribable. Catherine's transition was peaceful. Her neural activity remained organized until the very end, almost as if she was consciously letting go. Father Kelly's blessing over Catherine's preserved tissue created a moment of sacred recognition that this had been more than medical procedure. It had been a conscious act of love between sisters who'd shared one life across 7 years. The prayer acknowledged Catherine's sacrifice while celebrating the continued life her departure had made possible. "She was never meant to stay forever," the priest said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed enough mysteries to recognize divine intervention. "She came to help, and now her work is done." Margaret's recovery exceeded every medical prediction Dr. Morrison's team had made. Within hours of surgery, her cognitive function had improved dramatically, the pressure relief allowing her brain to operate with clarity she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Her first words upon waking were a whispered, "Thank you," directed not at the medical team, but at the empty space where Catherine had resided for 7 years. The family's reunion with Margaret took place in the intensive care unit, where monitors documented vital signs that belonged entirely to one person for the first time in 7 years. Emma was the first to speak, her 12-year-old wisdom cutting through the emotional complexity with characteristic directness. "Grandma, Catherine did her job, didn't she? She kept you safe until we were old enough to help take care of you ourselves." As evening fell over Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Margaret O'Sullivan lay in her ICU bed surrounded by 3 generations of family who'd learned that love could take forms beyond human imagination. The surgery had saved her life, but more importantly, it had revealed that the bonds between souls could transcend the boundaries of individual existence, creating connections that defied medical explanation while enriching human understanding of what it meant to truly care for another person. Margaret O'Sullivan's recovery progressed with unprecedented speed, her brain responding to the pressure relief like a garden emerging from drought. Within 3 days of surgery, she was sitting up in bed, engaging in conversations with a clarity and energy that her family hadn't seen since before Thomas's death. Dr. Morrison, making her evening rounds, found Margaret reading to Emma from the same book of Irish fairy tales that had comforted the family during surgery, her voice strong and animated as she brought the ancient stories to life. "Doctor, I need to tell you something that might sound strange," Margaret said after Emma had fallen asleep in the bedside chair. "I can still feel Catherine sometimes, not physically, but—" She paused, searching for words to describe an experience that had no medical terminology. "It's like she left an echo of herself, a warmth that lets me know she's still watching over our family. Is that possible, medically speaking?" "Doctor." Morrison had been expecting this conversation, having read about phantom limb syndrome and similar phenomena in surgical patients who'd lived with unusual anatomical conditions. The brain forms neural pathways based on years of experience, she explained gently. After 7 years of sharing consciousness with Catherine, it's natural that you would continue to feel her presence for some time. Think of it as your brain's way of honoring the relationship you had. The scientific explanation felt inadequate for the emotional reality Margaret was describing, but it provided a framework for understanding the continuation of connection beyond physical separation. The revelation that would shake the foundation of everything they thought they understood came not from medical testing, but from Father Kelly's confession on Margaret's 5th day of recovery. The elderly priest arrived at the hospital carrying a worn manila envelope and the weight of secrets he'd carried for 45 years. His arthritis made opening the envelope difficult, his weathered fingers struggling with paper that had yellowed with age and handling. "Maggie, there are things about Thomas's service in Vietnam that I've never told you," Father Kelly began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone about to violate the sacred seal of confession. Things he shared with me in the weeks before he died, when he knew his time was limited and his conscience wouldn't allow him to take these secrets to his grave. The priest's hands trembled as he withdrew a collection of documents, military reports, personal letters, and photographs that told a story spanning 5 decades. The photographs were what broke Margaret's composure. Black and white images from 1969 showed Thomas O'Sullivan in jungle fatigues, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a young Vietnamese woman holding twin infants, both girls, both bearing the distinctive features that Margaret would later recognize in her own grandchildren. And the woman's face held the exhausted beauty of someone who'd survived unimaginable hardship, and her protective positioning of the children suggested a fierce maternal love that transcended cultural boundaries. Her name was Lin Nguyen, Father Kelly continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas saved her and her daughters from a village that was destroyed by American forces. He couldn't save the village, but he could save them. He arranged for their passage to a refugee camp, gave them money, promised to help them reach America after the war. The priest's pause carried the weight of promises that had never been fulfilled. The twins were named Catherine and Margaret. The room seemed to shift around Margaret as the implications became clear. The growth that had shared her consciousness for 7 years hadn't been a random absorbed twin. It had been her spiritual connection to the Vietnamese child who'd borne her name, who died in a refugee camp in 1971, while Thomas was still fighting a war that prevented him from keeping his promise. Catherine's presence in Margaret's life had been Thomas's burden made manifest, his guilt and grief over the family he couldn't save creating a spiritual bridge that transcended time and mortality. Jimmy's reaction was immediate and visceral. His father's hidden history shattered decades of assumptions about the man who'd raised him with quiet dignity and unspoken pain. "He never said anything about saving anyone," Jimmy said, his voice breaking with the realization that his understanding of his father's war experience had been built on silence and omission. "He always talked about the things he couldn't save, the people he couldn't help. I never knew he'd actually saved anyone." Father Kelly's documentation revealed the full scope of Thomas's secret mission of mercy. Military records showed that he'd used his own pay to support Lynn and her daughters in the refugee camp, sending money through Catholic relief organizations long after his tour of duty ended. Letters from the camp, written in broken English and translated by missionaries, described the twins' brief lives: Catherine's death from malaria at age 2, Margaret's survival until age 4 before succumbing to malnutrition during the camp's final evacuation. Thomas never forgave himself for their deaths, Father Kelly explained, his pastoral experience evident in his gentle delivery of devastating truth. He believed he'd failed them by not bringing them to America sooner, by not doing more to ensure their survival. The guilt consumed him for 50 years, and I believe, though I can't prove this medically, that his grief somehow created the spiritual connection that manifested as Catherine's presence in your life. Dr. Morrison, who'd been listening to the revelation with professional skepticism, found herself reconsidering everything she understood about the relationship between emotional trauma and physical manifestation. The timing of Catherine's appearance, 3 days after Thomas's death, suddenly took on significance that went beyond medical coincidence. Are you suggesting that Mr. O'Sullivan's death somehow triggered the development of consciousness in tissue that had been dormant for decades? The question opened territory where medical science intersected with mysteries that couldn't be quantified or replicated in laboratory settings. Margaret's absorbed twin syndrome was documented fact, but the timing of Catherine's development and her apparent consciousness suggested influences that existed beyond current scientific understanding. Father Kelly's spiritual interpretation offered meaning that medical explanation couldn't provide, creating a narrative that honored both scientific observation and faith-based belief. Emma's reaction to the revelation demonstrated the profound wisdom that children sometimes possess when adults are overwhelmed by complexity. "So, Catherine wasn't just Grandma's twin," she said, her 12-year-old mind processing information that had shattered the adult's understanding. She was also the little girl in Vietnam that Grandpa couldn't save. She came to help Grandma carry Grandpa's sadness about not being able to help her when she was alive. The child's synthesis of spiritual and emotional reality provided clarity that adult analysis had failed to achieve. Margaret's response to learning Catherine's true identity transformed her grief over the separation into something approaching gratitude. "She came to tell me that Thomas wasn't a failure," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face as understanding replaced confusion. "All these years, I watched him carry guilt about the war, about things he said he couldn't save. Catherine came to show me that he did save someone, that his love reached across time and death to protect our family when we needed protection most." The revelation changed the entire family's understanding of Catherine's 7-year presence in their lives. She hadn't been a medical anomaly that developed consciousness. She'd been a messenger, a bridge between Thomas's wartime sacrifice and his family's peacetime struggles. Her growth during Margaret's grief over Thomas's death made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of spiritual connection rather than medical coincidence. Linda's nursing background helped her process the revelation in terms that bridged faith and science. Whether we call it spiritual intervention or psychological manifestation, Catherine's presence helped Margaret through the hardest period of her life, she observed. The mechanism might be beyond our understanding, but the result was healing. Sometimes that's what matters most, not how something works, but that it works when people need it most. Father Kelly's final revelation concerned the preserved tissue that continued to show minimal neural activity in Dr. Morrison's laboratory. The priest had received permission from the Vietnamese Catholic community in Chicago to perform blessing rites that would honor Catherine's sacrifice and release her spirit to rejoin the children she'd represented. "She's done her work," he said with the certainty of someone who'd witnessed enough miracles to recognize divine intervention. "It's time to let her go home." The transformation in Margaret's understanding of her experience with Catherine created a ripple effect throughout the family and medical community. What had begun as a medical mystery had revealed itself as a story of love transcending death, guilt transformed into grace, and healing that occurred on levels deeper than medicine could measure. Catherine's departure from Margaret's life wasn't an ending but a completion, the fulfillment of a promise that had taken 50 years to keep. 6 months after the surgery that separated Margaret O'Sullivan from the presence that had shared her consciousness for 7 years, Northwestern Memorial Hospital had returned to its normal rhythm of healing and crisis. But in room 412 of the neurology wing, where Margaret had spent her recovery, a small memorial plaque honored Catherine Nguyen, the Vietnamese child whose spirit had bridged continents and generations to offer comfort when it was needed most. Dr. Sarah Beth Morrison had insisted on the plaque, her own healing from twin loss finding expression in institutional recognition of Catherine's sacrifice. Margaret stood in her kitchen on Easter Sunday morning, preparing the traditional Irish breakfast that had marked every family celebration since her marriage to Thomas 50 years earlier. Her silver hair, grown back full and lustrous since the surgery, caught the morning light streaming through windows she'd cleaned with the vigor of someone given a second chance at life. And the scar where Catherine had resided was barely visible now, hidden beneath hair that seemed healthier and more vibrant than it had been in years. "Grandma, you're humming again," Emma observed, setting the table with the good china that had belonged to Margaret's mother. At 13, Emma had grown into the role of family archivist, collecting stories and photographs that documented the O'Sullivan family history with particular attention to the chapter that included Catherine's presence. Her school project on hidden heroes in family history had won the 8th grade history fair and prompted conversations throughout Bridgeport about the invisible ways people carry each other through difficult times. Jimmy arrived with Linda and Tommy, carrying a bouquet of white roses that had become the family's traditional tribute to Catherine's memory. The flowers would be placed in the garden behind St. Alphonsus Church, where Father Kelly had created a small memorial space for the children who watch over us from heaven. Tommy, now 9 and no longer frightened by discussions of his grandmother's former condition, had become Catherine's most devoted advocate, insisting that she be included in family prayers and remembered at every celebration. "How are you feeling today, Ma?" Jimmy asked, studying his mother's face for signs of the fatigue that had marked her final months with Catherine. What he saw instead was a vitality that reminded him of the woman who'd raised him, sharp-eyed, quick-witted, and possessed of the Irish gift for finding humor in the darkest circumstances. Margaret's recovery had exceeded every medical prediction, her brain function returning to levels that Dr. Morrison described as remarkable for someone who'd lived with increased intracranial pressure for 7 years. "I feel lighter," Margaret replied, the same response she'd given to that question for 6 months. But today the words carried additional meaning as she prepared to share news that would reshape the family's understanding of Catherine's legacy. "But I also feel like I'm still carrying something important. Something Catherine left with me that I'm supposed to share with all of you." Her pause carried the weight of someone who'd spent months processing revelations that challenged everything she'd believed about the boundaries between life and death. Father Kelly arrived precisely at noon, his timing perfected by decades of Easter dinners with the O'Sullivan family. The elderly priest moved more slowly than he had before Catherine's surgery, his arthritis aggravated by the emotional weight of revelations that had challenged his own understanding of divine intervention. But his eyes held the peace of someone who'd witnessed miracles that confirmed rather than contradicted his faith in God's mysterious ways. "Father, I've been having dreams," Margaret said as the family gathered around the dining room table that had hosted 3 generations of celebrations and sorrows. "Not the kind of dreams I used to have, but something different. I dream about Vietnam, about places I've never been and people I've never met. I dream about Lynn Nguyen and her daughters, about Thomas's time in the war, about promises kept and burdens shared." Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd learned to distinguish between imagination and revelation. Dr. Morrison, who'd become an honorary family member since Catherine's surgery, listened to Margaret's description with the analytical mind of someone who'd spent months studying the intersection of consciousness and memory. "The neural pathways that developed during your years with Catherine wouldn't simply disappear after surgery," she explained. "It's possible that the memories and experiences she processed are now accessible to your conscious mind." You might be remembering things Catherine experienced through her spiritual connection to the Vietnamese children. Linda's nursing background helped her ask the practical questions that the family needed answered. Are these dreams disturbing you? Are they interfering with your sleep or daily activities? Her concern reflected the family's collective fear that Margaret's recovery might be complicated by psychological after-effects of her unusual experience with Catherine. "They're not disturbing," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering new capacities within herself. "They're beautiful dreams, full of love and forgiveness and understanding. I see Thomas as a young soldier, scared and far from home, trying to save people in impossible circumstances. I see Lynn's gratitude and her daughter's innocence. I understand now why Catherine came to me, why she stayed so long, and why she was able to let go when the time was right." Emma's question cut through the adult conversation with the directness that had always characterized her approach to family mysteries. "Grandma, do you think Catherine is still with the little girls she represented? Do you think they're together now in heaven?" The question reflected the child's need to understand not just Catherine's departure, but her destination, to know that sacrifice led to reunion rather than simply ending. Father Kelly's response drew on 50 years of theological study and pastoral experience with families navigating loss and faith. "I believe Catherine's work was to help your grandmother understand that love transcends death, that promises made in love are never truly broken even when circumstances prevent their fulfillment. Now that her work is done, I believe she's been reunited with the children she represented, and they're all at peace together." The revelation that Margaret had been saving for this Easter gathering emerged slowly, like dawn breaking over Lake Michigan. "I want to use the insurance settlement from my medical case to establish a scholarship fund," she announced, her voice carrying the determination of someone who'd discovered her life's final mission. "The Catherine Nguyen Memorial Scholarship will help Vietnamese American children attend college, particularly those studying medicine or social work. It's what Thomas would have wanted, and it's what Catherine's presence in my life was trying to tell me." Jimmy's response reflected his growing understanding of the connections between his father's wartime service and his family's present circumstances. "Ma, Dad would be so proud. He carried guilt about those children for 50 years, never knowing that his love for them had created something beautiful in our family. This scholarship will honor their memory and his sacrifice in the best possible way." Dr. Morrison's announcement added another layer of meaning to Catherine's legacy. "The case study of your condition has been published in the New England Journal of Medicine," she shared, her voice carrying the excitement of someone whose work was contributing to medical understanding. Medical schools are using Catherine's case to teach students about the relationship between consciousness and identity, about the ways that love and trauma can manifest in physical form. Her story is helping doctors understand that healing involves more than just treating symptoms. The Easter dinner proceeded with the rituals that had sustained the O'Sullivan family through generations of celebration and crisis. Tommy's blessing included gratitude for Catherine, who helped Grandma, and the little girls in Vietnam who are with her now. Linda's traditional Irish soda bread was dedicated to the women who carry each other through hard times. Jimmy's toast honored the soldiers who save people and the families who remember their sacrifice. As the afternoon sunlight faded into the soft glow of Chicago evening, Margaret sat in her garden surrounded by 3 generations of family who'd learned that love could take forms beyond human imagination. The white roses they'd brought in Catherine's memory bloomed alongside the spring flowers that marked the season of resurrection and renewal. Emma read aloud from the letters that had begun arriving from Vietnamese American families who'd heard Catherine's story and wanted to share their own experiences of carrying ancestors' memories and healing generational trauma. Father Kelly's closing prayer acknowledged the mystery that had brought their family together with the spirit of children who died half a century earlier in a refugee camp halfway around the world. We thank you, Lord, for Catherine's presence in our lives, for the love that transcends death, and for the understanding that no sacrifice made in love is ever truly lost. Help us to carry forward the lessons she taught us about bearing each other's burdens and finding healing in the most unexpected places. Margaret's final words of the evening were addressed to the memorial space in her garden, where Catherine's presence was honored alongside the memory of the Vietnamese children whose names she'd carried. "Thank you for staying with me through the hardest years," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me that Thomas's love reached across time and distance to protect our family. Rest in peace now, all of you. Your work is done, and we'll carry your story forward with love." The O'Sullivan family's story became a testament to the truth that healing often comes from unexpected sources, that love can manifest in forms beyond human understanding, and that the greatest miracles occur when people choose to bear each other's burdens with grace. Catherine's 7-year presence in Margaret's life had transformed not just one family but the medical community's understanding of consciousness, the Bridgeport neighborhood's appreciation for hidden struggles, and the broader recognition that some angels never get wings but help others learn to fly. As Easter evening settled over Chicago, Margaret O'Sullivan sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, feeling the profound contentment of someone who'd discovered that her life's greatest challenges had also been her greatest blessings. The scar where Catherine had resided was invisible now, but the love that had prompted her presence would continue to ripple through generations of lives touched by the story of two sisters who'd shared one consciousness and discovered that true healing comes from helping others carry what they cannot bear alone. Dear friends, Margaret O'Sullivan's story reminds us that life's greatest burdens often carry our most profound blessings in disguise. At 62, when she thought her story was ending, Margaret discovered that love transcends every boundary we think defines us, even the boundaries of life and death itself. For 7 years, she carried Catherine, not knowing that this mysterious presence was actually carrying her through grief, loneliness, and the weight of her husband's unspoken war trauma. How many of us have felt invisible companions during our darkest hours? How often have we discovered that what seemed like our greatest trials were actually preparing us for our most meaningful contributions? Margaret's journey from shame to understanding, from isolation to community, from medical mystery to spiritual revelation, shows us that it's never too late for transformation. Her decision to honor Catherine's memory through scholarship, to turn personal suffering into service for others, proves that our later years can be our most purposeful. Every scar tells a story of survival. Every burden carried makes us stronger. Every ending becomes a new beginning when viewed through the lens of love. Your story isn't over. It's still being written, and the next chapter might be your most beautiful yet. Questions for reflection. What invisible companions have helped carry you through life's most difficult seasons? How might your own struggles be preparing you to help others in ways you've never imagined? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.